Welcome to the Indian Nations Conservation Alliance podcast, where Native voices lead the conversation on conservation, stewardship, and our responsibilities to the lands and waters that sustain us. Across Indian country, our homelands carry stories of relationship, resilience, and knowledge passed down through generations of people who live with the land and listen to what it teaches. Through conversations with tribal producers, ranchers, conservation leaders, elders, and community partners, we share the teachings and experience that continue to guide how we care for the water, the land, and the living systems that surround us. Together across Indian country, we recognize the spirit carried in our waters, our homelands, and our ecosystems, and we honor our role as caretakers for those yet to come. I want to begin today by honoring the land, the waters, and the knowledge systems that have guided Indigenous stewardship long before universities or scientific institutions existed. Traditional ecological knowledge has always been a living system of observation, responsibility, and relationship. Today's conversation is about what it means to create space for TEK inside academic programs in natural resource management and watershed science. I'm honored today, joined by Dr. Christopher A. Frissel, an aquatic ecologist and educator who serves as the director of Master's Natural Resource Management program at Salish Kootenai College. Through his leadership, Indigenous students are able to bring the cultural knowledge, community priorities, and relationships with land, water directly into academic research and environmental decision making. For many Indigenous students, entering academic spaces has historically meant navigating systems that did not recognize their knowledge as science or research. Traditional ecological knowledge was often excluded, minimized, or treated as separate from environmental knowledge. At Salish Kootenai College, that dynamic looks different. Programs like natural resource management are structured in ways that allow Indigenous students to engage in watershed science, fisheries biology, and hydrology while staying grounded in cultural teachings and community responsibilities. Programs like natural resource management are structured in ways that allow Indigenous students to engage in watershed science, fisheries biology, and hydrology while staying grounded in cultural teachings and community responsibilities. As director of the master's program, Dr. Frissel plays an important role in helping support an academic environment where traditional ecological knowledge is not just included, but is respected as a foundation for environmental leadership. Dr. Frissel, I'd like to start by asking you to share a bit about your role as the director of the Masters of Natural Resource Management program here at Salish Kootenai College. Also, what does it mean to you to work in an academic environment where Indigenous knowledge systems are central to the program? And however you want to introduce yourself, please.
Okay, I'm Chris Frissel, instructor here at Salish Kootenai College and chairman of the Department of Hydrology and the Natural Resources undergraduate programs, and also the director of the graduate program in Natural Resources Management here, which offers a master's degree. Fairly new program. Established the graduate program was established with a grant by the National Science Foundation. I guess in terms of what it means to me I should also mention, by the way, that I'm the third in line to be the serve as director of that program. And the program was initiated by a grant proposal, I believe, about at least 6 years ago. And there's a lot of people who put a lot of effort and thought and a lot of their energy and talent into formulating this program and setting it up. So I'm kind of at that steering. I have the steering wheel in my hand right now, but it's a program that's based on a lot of people's good thoughts and hard work, and just like to acknowledge that. In terms of what it means to me, I do think it's a really important program and has been important to a lot of people who are going through it or have gone through it, and maybe a lot more people for for whom it's an opportunity in the future. And for me, there's a multiple levels at which I really value the work of participating in this program or leading it. Is there's a high level sort of policy political view that involves tribal governments and the federal government and state governments and even local governments, about how all those interact. And the what we see with a lot of tribal governments is a sort of rising stability in terms of their policies, politics, their ethics, that we don't necessarily see in other non-tribal governments at the moment. And so at that sort of global level, that's a really important trend in terms of the future of resources management. Tribes can are increasingly serving a leadership role in our profession and in that public policy arena. At a next level down, it's really engaging for me. Well, it's an opportunity for me to feel like I'm giving to the community that I've lived in for quite a few decades now. A lot prior to working at Salish Kootenai College, I worked as a researcher and a scientist working for a non-governmental organization. Most of that work was directed towards West Coast watersheds and fisheries. A lot of public land management work, trips to Washington, D.C., but I lived here more or less as an anonymous citizen. And working at SKC has really given me the opportunity to give to this community. I feel really valued that because the college has really, and the students and my colleagues here have really valued what I can bring to the table in terms of the, what SKC can do for students. So, I think I'll.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. I want to acknowledge that how you you understand that there was people before you that developed this program, that there was a lot of hands that came into play, that even though you're in the steering ship, you're acknowledging that all the hard work that people did to create this program for what it is today. It's a relatively new program, but I think it's really an awesome program. And kind of leading into our segment of creating space for traditional ecological knowledge in academia. Many universities, students are asked to separate cultural knowledge from scientific research. How is that experience different here at Salish Kootenai College under the Natural Resource Program?
Well, I think up and down all the programs at Salish Kootenai College, and from the very origins of the college when it was established many years ago, there was a explicit goal for this institution to recognize indigenous knowledge and tribal perspectives, and with a particular emphasis, of course, on the local tribes' perspectives, but also opening the door to really all other indigenous viewpoints as well. But this is a space that was created to provide a place for the indigenous and tribal perspective to be represented and to be given a home and to be really carried forward and not buried as many educational institutions expect you to, at least seemingly, they expect you to bury your cultural perspectives and participate in a new culture, a new academic culture, or a science-based culture, or whatever. It's the same. It's really very similar in non-science disciplines in higher education, generally speaking. So this is an upside down institution in terms of respect for culture being the respect for culture other than simply academic culture being at the top of the list of goals.
Yeah, yeah. SKC has always been indigenous perspective first. And I'm glad that we're able to bring this into the master's level program and presenting thesis research, thesis projects, just really surrounding that traditional knowledges and incorporating it as legitimate research and understanding that TEK, although new on paper and new in academia, is has been around for tens and thousands of years. Like the empirical data that we've been taking and using and putting it into not just theory but to practice shows it's been around for millennials. Yeah.
Mhm.
What what does what does it look like when TEK is treated as a legitimate research framework rather than supplemental knowledge?
Well, really, it opens a whole bunch of doors conceptually, and really, it's about concepts and it's about assumptions about how the world works and what questions are important to ask. And so when I myself was in graduate school in the master's program, I kind of had the attitude going into it that okay, I've had 4 years of classes. I actually took a few graduate courses as an undergrad. I felt like I was ready to roll. I knew what science was all about and ready to put it to work. But I quickly learned there's a whole lot more to learn. And my first few quarters as a master's student, I had instructors who really opened my eyes to the kind of standard assumptions, the normal assumptions that prevail in Western perspectives, European Western perspectives, particularly that science has some superior objectivity, that it's detached from cultural bias, and the structures I had really put the lie to that, basically examining how Western science does work and how it has implicit cultural biases that determine, what is considered to be science worth pursuing and science not worth pursuing. So if you recognize that cultural biases play a really important role in the very question of what questions science is allowed to answer, then that opens up the door to having a broader and more diverse cultural perspectives to identify what important questions are. So the methodology may be similar. The method and methodology of science and how we do science and how we move forward in sorting out right assumptions from wrong assumptions about how the world works. Um, that may be common no matter what your initial starting question is and what the cultural importance of answering the question is, but the methodology of how we work through addressing a question, how do we gather information and data, how do we understand it, how do we formulate it in ways that allow us to go out and make observations that test the veracity of our assumptions about cause and effect. Those things can be common those are common to science regardless of your starting point or what question you're asking. So that's the key to it by broadening the cultural perspectives and diversifying the cultural perspectives at the front end, at the gateway to science. You're opening up a much broader set of phenomena and a whole different set of assumptions about what's important to study, right?
Right. No, the importance of I do want to know what you said about cultural bias and how it impacts Western academia, particularly. When we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it wasn't completely fleshed out, and he later on admitted that in his journal entries before he passed away. Understanding that where he got his major influence from was indigenous perspectives in the Siksika Nation in Canada. The hierarchy needs didn't didn't just stop at self-actualization. It went into a community-based, community realization to cultural perpetuity. And in his later discovery, or not his later discovery, he discovered that, but it wasn't allowed into academic research at the time. And I think that's what one of the things that we see in cultural biasness was, even if the research is saying, hey, there's more to it than this, but then we have academic restrictions, then those fully fleshed ideas can't really come into academia like traditional ecological knowledge. So I'm sure it has been around with major researchers across the board, but then we have to have it peer reviewed and in an academic sense, and the research purposes, and ultimately they get to shift what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And I think it's stunted us and stunted TEK in a way that it's only just recently allowed that form of thinking into academic research just within, I think, the last 20 years.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I totally agree. And it's actually, I would say, since we're talking about a program in natural resources management, the embeddedness of cultural biases and the implicit political nature of those biases is even more obvious than it is in sort of what we call the more basic sciences, or something that's more abstract like mathematics. They're very upfront biases in terms of what questions are funded. You can, as an academic scientist, you're free to ask lots of questions, but there's only a small subset of those that there'll be enough interest by the agencies that have money to actually fund the work. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of my research has actually been funded by non-governmental organizations, because they're funding me to ask questions that the government was not willing to spend much money on.
Right.
And tribes have funded some of my work as well. So.
Yeah, working with it, I think that highlights a whole nother topic too, of just when we're looking at questions that want to be answered and how politically they can get swayed through non-government organizations to tribal organizations to the federal government, and particularly who funds those types of projects. It's the political, I think, atmosphere is very dictating of what the questions are even asked to what the questions are being answered.
Yeah. So you identified the sort of back end constraints associated with peer review and what's deemed acceptable within the bounds of the discipline, and I highlighted the front end of what you even get to work on in the first place. And then eating and having a home.
The political hoops and the political spheres, it gets the mental jumping jacks definitely get tiresome. When we're looking at those political spheres, and I kind of want to acknowledge, and leading into my next question, Indigenous leadership and natural resource management. Yeah. Why is it important that Indigenous students using TEK are leading research in their homelands and watershed areas?
Well, for the communities who interact with and depend on those areas, it's really important because there's been a deficit in investment of science and understanding and scientific understanding, or scientific informing of management in those areas, right? So there's a clear underinvestment in reservations in many fronts, human health among them, but also in the natural resources research and front end. So that has been shifting in recent, the past couple of decades, with tribes moving, just reassuming more sovereignty over their natural resources and reasserting their right to to have control over the work that does go on the reservation, and there's been an increase in resources available for work on reservations in at least the last couple of decades, maybe, which has been a really good thing. But often it's been difficult for the individuals who are interested in doing that work to find a place in academia where they can find a fit between their cultural experience and worldview and the kind of instruction and mentorship that they are provided. So that's really the point of the graduate program, I guess, that we're talking about. Really, that's the very reason why it was formed, is to create a space for that to happen.
Yeah, creating space for traditional knowledge is, I think, SKC has almost been a pioneer in that. Shifting it back home, when we talked about what you said, working in creating spaces, going home, doing research, there is multiple hoops. And I think we even mentioned the IRB process for tribal governments or tribal reservations, particularly, kind of staying in that same area, what role do tribal priorities play in shaping graduate research within the program?
Well, a couple of, it has not been really highly formalized in terms of we have not had like a formal advisory committee from tribal leaders, tribal agency, land and water managers. But we have lots of personal contacts on almost a daily basis with people who do represent the tribes in those ways. So it's mostly been like peer to peer between faculty and tribal leaders and managers to identify issues of interest. But it's also the way we've approached it to date has been really on the students' shoulders to find their way, right? Pick their place, find their way, and do the homework that's associated with developing local support at the tribal level for the research that they'd like to do. And that's not always easy, right? That's been a struggle for many students, a very good struggle. I think it's an important educational experience, even though it can be difficult. But that's not going to change, right? They acquire skills from meeting that challenge that are going to serve them well through their careers.
Yeah,
and so and actually, in a lot of ways, someone like me isn't very well equipped to teach them how to navigate in their home community and on their reservation, because those are very specific politics and histories that they're dealing with, and family relationships, and all of that comes together in navigating that approach. But we have the program is designed so that it allows for fully remote participation, so students can take all of the courses online. They also can do many of the courses face-to-face if they choose, but they can remain at a distance and take the courses online and then do their research wherever they want to do that. And we have a lot of flexibility in terms of who can participate in graduate committees. So you can have a mentor from your local community or your tribe, if that is that you're working with closely to develop that research.
No, I do want to highlight that. Creating the next generation of, scientists, going back to that, you're not just a scientist, but you're going to eventually help somebody who needs to go through those steps and those processes that a lot of non-native, non-indigenous people that don't live on the reservation those complexities, like the IRB process that majority of Western academia doesn't have to deal with. Navigating, systems and cultures that are particular to those sovereign entities on reservations, you know, um, and finding a peer, somebody to help you kind of grab your hand and walk you through the process and show you that way you can eventually return, grab somebody else's hand and walk them through the process, because navigating the complex systems on a reservation, not only just the complex systems, but the political spheres,
Mhm.
the the leadership change, it's all brand new to most people that ain't equipped to living on a reservation or working with reservations. And I think supporting that next generation of scientists is really, really important.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of tribal governments, if you get a master's degree, you're going to be very quickly moved into a position where you are in charge of programs and employees, and you are in a mentorship role very quickly in your career. So,
Yeah, no, that's good. That's very good. No, I like that. You Whoever's listening in, talking about those processes and the hoops, and just recognizing them and being transparent about how to go about just moving through the system for indigenous scientists wanting to do indigenous work on Indian reservations. There is a process where you have to go through the IRB process and work with tribal leadership to get things approved, and that's just to protect sovereign ideas and cultural immunity, and the whole idea of working with a different government system. Moving into bridging knowledge systems. What what does respectful collaboration between Western science and traditional ecological knowledge look like in practice?
yeah, for me, um, at the heart of it, that it gets back to the point I made earlier about how the methods of inquiry might be very similar across many, to address many different kinds of questions. The basic process of scientific inquiry is fairly universal, and but the question that's asked, or the question that is addressed, through that inquiry can be uh, it's very robust and wide open. What question is considered to be important within any cultural context or community context or political context, for that matter. The That's just having the door open to, it when what becomes really negative, and what I've really fought through my entire career, from the even before I was a graduate student, I think, and that is that when the door is closed about what questions can be asked, and when science is used to as the excuse for having that door closed, or being very narrow and excluding different cultural perspectives in determining what science is going to address. And so for me, it's been a lot about opening that door to different perspectives, whether it's, um, well, they can be defined in multitude of different ways. But certainly the indigenous worldview was really deliberately not represented in the allowable scientific questions. When I started as an undergraduate, it was a very rigid, that door was very narrow. So it's opened up a lot, in the span of my career. So that's good to see. Although there's certainly a lot of people who would like to close it back up again.
No, understandable. I'm glad that you talked on your topic of your career, kind of working into my next question, um, surrounding the indigenous knowledge systems. Now, throughout your career, as you said, you started almost in your undergrad series. You've worked in watershed conservation across the Pacific Northwest. How has your perspective on indigenous knowledge systems evolved over time?
Well, I think like a lot of others, I've definitely I've become cognizant and appreciative of how much, particularly for tribes who've not been severely displaced from their homelands, how much cultural knowledge of places and phenomena and processes and what's important to sustain natural resources, how much cultural knowledge there is about that within indigenous communities. Um, I've become so personally cognizant of that through interactions with tribal people and scientists working for tribal sponsored research organizations, for example. Um, so, like everybody else, right? That's kind of been a trend. But I also found I guess I would have to say that in my own personal perspective, which was shaped before I ever got to college, tends to have a lot of alignment with tribal views. So, in terms of seeing the world as integrated and connect and all things connected, and the um, importance of continuity in man's relationship with nature, and that can result in a sustainable relationship. All those things seem to be embedded in me, because of my, you know, presumably because of my childhood experience. And um, I was raised in a family that spent a lot of time outdoors. My dad was a forestry professor, and he was carrying me around the forests of Minnesota as he was doing research on fire history back in the 60s. So yeah, there's probably a lot of that was baked into me as a kid. But, but, um, but yeah, and it's come around as an instructor now at a tribal college. It's really fascinating to teach ecology, to tribal students because they come with that same package. You don't have to teach them the principles of ecology. You have to teach them how Western science does ecology, right? Right.
Yeah.
But it's not the same when you're teaching students who don't have tribal backgrounds. And that what's really fascinating to me is I see this even in uh, Indian people who grew up in the city. They still come with with the ecological package in their brains, but you teach other kids from cities, and no, they have to learn the concepts, and they have to be convinced that really all things really are connected, and some of the basic principles of ecology like that uh, they don't they don't buy it out of the gate. So
No, right. When we're looking at, DNA and being tied to a certain place, usually reservations where the people come from, I think it's important to note that even though we may have felt like we've forgotten, the land doesn't forget us, and that cultural reciprocity that, like you say, and there was a lot of Indian removal in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and on the Indian Removal Act from reservations to major cities, but they still kept that core balance of having respect and continuity and that ecological processes for their surrounding areas, their natural reciprocation. I've noticed that too, and I think that's something that's embedded in their DNA, and just working with indigenous knowledge systems in general. Kind of moving into what I want to talk about is supporting our next generation of students and keeping that cultural responsibility of our surrounding environments, our ecosystems that we're trying to protect. What strengths do indigenous students bring into natural resource management? I know we already talked about kind of already having that ecological depth understanding that are overlooked in mainstream academic settings.
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think there's a lot of ways to answer it. There's a lot of answers to that question, but I think one of the ones that I've that surprised me the most and also encouraged me the most is what those students bring is connections to their community and the body of knowledge that resides in their community. Their ability to learn from elders and relatives who have experience in those ecosystems, common shared experiences, not always the same experiences, a lot of times very diverse kinds of experiences, but also always centered on the place. And so that's tapping into that reservoir of community knowledge that's got a lot of depth, intergenerational depth. To me, that's one of the most important and significant and also underappreciated things that tribal students bring.
Right. Yeah. Being a tribal student and being in SKC Master's Natural Resource Management program, just highlighting how much TEK can already be integrated into academia. I felt like I was right in place, coming from a cultural background, speaking my language, practicing my culture, and trying to teach it to my kids now too. I think it's equally reciprocal for SKC being the pioneer that it is to give recognition to is, I think, detrimental to Indian kids or indigenous students across the Indian country. Looking ahead, what role do you see indigenous-led research playing in the future of traditional ecological science and conservation?
Um, hmm. Well, there's a lot of stars aligned across the disciplines. Having been to a few national and international conferences in the last few years since COVID, and sort of touching base in the restoration science community, the ecological research community, the fisheries and wildlife management communities. In every one of those arenas, it's respect for traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous perspectives and engagement of indigenous people in the discipline and the practices of the discipline has become a really major goal. Now, it's not a very successfully met goal yet, but it's a pretty deeply embedded goal in those disciplines. I think it will well outlive short-term political um, resistance, and because I think it's very deep-seated at intergenerationally now seated enough that it's going to keep moving forward. And I think what it means for Indigenous students is that they will have, they already have opportunities that are far beyond what they can actually take advantage of in many cases, like free trips to free registration and rooms at conferences and things like that. We actually have difficulties getting those opportunities met by our students. So there's a lot of opportunity out that just because for various reasons students have families and they have a lot going on. So anyway, but there's already a ton of opportunity that's been created and is continuously being created by the professional organizations in the natural resources management disciplines. So and science in general. So I think that's going to continue. I don't think that opportunity is going to disappear, and I think it's going to keep growing. Um, so that's good from the side of the receptivity of Western science to indigenous perspectives, and this is global, by the way. It's not just in the U.S. It's see it in Australia, you see it. See it in Europe, although Europe is still a ways behind in recognizing who their indigenous communities are. I had an interesting talk with Rand about that a few months ago.
Yeah.
But they talk the talk, right? So, so yeah. So I what was the question again?
It was just kind of indigenous leadership, indigenous led research playing,
Yeah.
the future of TEK science
Yeah.
and conservation.
Yeah, and I think I alluded to this earlier too, that the tribes have the opportunity, and many have been taking up that opportunity to establish a lot more stable um, political structures to manage their resources, and not just the political but professional structures that associated with that. But they're stable. They're increasingly stable politically, and allowing professionals to do their work um, in ethical ways, right? And ethics, including the cultural aspects of ethics and the scientific ethics, scientific side of that, of ethical practice. So, the tribes are definitely emerging as in the Pacific Northwest for sure. Many of the tribes have emerged as go-tos for scientific resources and even data. Tribes are starting to outpace some of the longstanding Western structures for housing data and making ecological data on fisheries and habitat and watersheds available to the public. Partly because on the Western side, things get kicked around politically so much, and data agencies that are involved in making data available to the public tend to become a political target for people who want control of the data, and so they get kicked around and public access gets lost.
Oh wow, that's really interesting. We constantly thinking about conservation, and we're always drawn back into the political sphere of interpretation. How do you see programs like the Natural Resource Management at SKC shaping the future of environmental leadership across Indian country?
Um, I think maybe the main thing that programs like ours can do is simply build the confidence of the individuals that come to us for education, just building the confidence in their own knowledge, their own values. And we can equip them with the tools that it takes to navigate the world in terms of what's standard Western practice. How do you, if you need to bridge between the Western view to convince some non-tribal entity that they should do something, how do you build that bridge, both in terms of scientific practice, but also ethical practice? And that's it's the working knowledge of practices that we kind of equip the students with, that then empowers them to realize their capacity is, that they can, the things that they know and the things that they believe in, they can bring to bear in their everyday work, and it doesn't become, the work isn't separate from their person.
Yeah, no, that's really, really powerful. Is here at SKC, build the student, allow their traditional knowledges to come at the forefront, allowing understanding of bridging that traditional knowledges with Western science to really put at the forefront their indigenous experiences. I mean, like, I got to give it to SKC again, being a pioneer of traditional knowledges, being at the forefront, allowing those elders to come in and be interviewed as experts is important. Finally seeing their knowledges as important as PhDs or master's thesis, allowing that empirical data to say, hey, this is what my knowledges have been for the last 10,000 years. I think it's worth something. And then creating that space for Indigenous empowerment students is, I think, really important. But one of the most powerful things that come through in this conversation is the idea that academic programs can become places where traditional ecological knowledge is strengthened rather than set aside. What does it look like when environmental education supports both scientific training and cultural responsibility?
Well, I think what it looks like is, I mean, where it leads is empowerment, right? It's kind of we allow students a choice of. There's a spectrum right here. There's a tension, right, between sort of the Western science, the Western ways of doing things in resource management, and then the Indigenous cultural perspectives, which can be very diverse and deep seated. The it really, I think, what we try to equip the students to do is to be able to build that bridge. Number one, as we just discussed, have confidence in their understanding of the world and their cultural and community experience, but also to be able to build that bridge to the Western side when there's a need to, and there often is, to communicate and collaborate. So being able to speak the language of Western science and to be able to convince someone who's embedded in that perspective that the knowledge that you hold is defensible, valid, useful, and a important base to move forward from. That's you can sort of choose where you land and how far you want to build that bridge, or how far you want, which side of the bridge you want to center yourself on at a given time. But being able to having the skill of understanding the two worlds and the kinds of what they accept as legitimate, scientific knowledge is allows the students to be able to just navigate the process. You kind of work whichever side of that bridge is the most productive at a given time, and being able to go back and forth is really key.
Right.
And it's only going to happen a little bit from the Western science side, right? So the Indigenous side, the more that they can move across from their side towards the other side and take advantage of that opportunity, right? The bridge has kind of been built now, but can we, engage enough people in the Indigenous side to go more than halfway across? That's the opportunity they've got right now. So
Right. Create an opportunity for those that traditional knowledge is to be at the forefront. I mean, the ultimate goal is, sustain environmental practices, protect ecosystems that we participate in on the regular. That's the goal. And when we as Indigenous people just want to bring to the forefront as, hey, we got this traditional knowledges that's ultimately going to support the goal, is help the ecosystems, protect the ecosystems, and participate in the ecosystems. And I think so sometimes we remove ourselves from the goal when we're getting into these political talks and saying, well, TEK is not enough. Here's the Western side. Well, is it getting too far away from the goal? Are we protecting the ecosystems? And that's I think the most important thing that's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say in terms of accepting that as the goal is definitely the Western science side of things has coalesced around similar understanding that if we don't have that as our goal, we are destined to fail, right? As a society. And so so that's part of what's created the opportunity. But the indigenous world has a lot deeper experience in making that goal how you live.
Right. Doctor, I want to thank you for your role and thank you for your role you play in helping create academic pathways where Indigenous students can carry knowledge systems forward into watershed science and in natural resource management using traditional ecological knowledge. I raise my hands to you for supporting students who are working to protect their homelands through both science and traditional ecological knowledge. Before we close, is there anything you'd like to share with students who are thinking about entering in environmental science while staying grounded in their cultural responsibilities?
I guess I would just share some practical advice on that front, and I actually share this with most graduate students, not only Indigenous people, but if you're in a graduate program and you find it is not a home for you, that it's hostile in some way, that you feel out of place, and there isn't space for what you want to do, what you really want to do as a student, then look to move. Don't hesitate to leave a program and find another one that is going to be a better fit for you. I've seen many students. In fact, the usual outcome for students who struggle through a program that is not a home for them is that they end up leaving the discipline altogether to something else with their lives. So we lose a lot of we lose in our line of work, we lose a lot of important talent and human capacity because people who leave as a result of having bad experiences in graduate school, particularly. So, on the other hand, it will be a struggle. Graduate school is supposed to be you're supposed to be. It's something you have to work at, right? You will be challenged. You'll be challenged in multiple ways, and you'll need to work through it. But you should be able to feel that it's a home for you. And anyway, that's, I guess, my advice is don't hesitate to find a better place if the one you're at isn't working for you.
Awesome. Thank you, Doctor, for sitting down and being a part of this Indian Nations Collective Alliance podcast. The entire theme was creating traditional ecological knowledge and natural resource management education. But being a student and being Native, Indigenous, understanding that that looks different in all sorts of ways, from the political hemispheres back on the reservations to the political hemispheres in the institution itself to just academia in general. Traditional ecological knowledge looks different in all sorts of different ways. So thank you again for creating those pathways, building those bridges, and just having a depth understanding of Indigenous people's perspective and allowing that to be at the forefront at the table.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to do this. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you for listening to the Inca podcast. This program is supported through grant funding from the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Rural Climate Smart Initiative, and the Indigenous Grazing Lands Coalition. These efforts help support grassroots producers, tribal ranchers, and the conservation partners working to strengthen stewardship across Indian country as a whole. The views expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA. To learn more about Inca and our work, visit us online and join us for the next conversation. Thank you.